So yeah, thank you guys for coming in to one of our webinars of our Inspired Week webinar series. This one is going to be all about our Inspired Reader and Writer program and how that connects with the different stages of reading development. So to introduce myself, my name is Rebecca Bush. I'm the primary program director here at Baker & Bloom. I've been in education for quite a while now. I was a classroom teacher for a number of years. I'm originally from the US, where I taught there. I taught in Latin America, and of course here in Hong Kong as well. Outside of the classroom teacher, I've been a teacher trainer, curriculum developer, reading specialist, number of different things. I have 2 master's degrees. My first is in elementary education, so kind of that overall piece of elementary education, but also really focused on bilingual education and that language acquisition process. My second is in advanced literacy. So I am a certified reading specialist, which means that I really understand the kind of nitty-gritty details of what that reading process looks like and how to pinpoint when it might be going wrong, and then how to help support that. But I'm also a certified special education teacher, classroom teacher, and bilingual instructor. And I've also done over 200 hours of training in multisensory intervention, which means I'm a dyslexia therapist as well. So a lot of work and a lot of training going into teaching kids how to read. And here I am at Baker & Bloom Education Center here in Wan Chai. We are an education center, K1 through year 13 through grade 12, so all the way across. And really all of our programs come down to what we call our 4-leaf approach. So these are what we boiled down to, those kind of 4 key things that we think all of our learners should have. And these will come out in all of our different programs, including our IRW, which we'll be talking about here in a minute. But we have a lot of other programs, all of which come around this mission of what we call creative literacy. So this is my way of showing what I think creative literacy means, that it is a flexible mindset you can use to approach any problem and think laterally and then express your thoughts and your process. We will be talking a lot about the Inspired Reader and Writer, but we do have a number of other programs here. We have creative writing, which is a really exciting addition that we have, as well as STEM and STEM and STEAM actually, and public speaking. And we also have kind of the more traditional academic ones. So we do a lot of admissions prep for kids to get into boarding schools and switching into international schools, of course, university as well. And then test prep, and that academic coaching is the one-on-one tutoring in small groups that we do, which is purely based on what those kids need. Also very, very exciting, we have a new program, which is our Bloom Innovation Program. We are launching a new bilingual primary and secondary school, which is very exciting. But today we're here to talk about our Inspired Reader and Writer. This really is our cornerstone program in our primary division. It is a K through 6 program, so K1 through grade 6, and it spirals through. So we're going to talk a little bit about our program. And we're also going to talk really about how the reading, right? So I know some of you guys might have been in my talk earlier today where we talked a little bit about the reading. So this first bit might be a little bit of an overlap, but just so we're all on the same page when we talk about what that reading process actually looks like, I'm going to kind of go over a little overview before we get into the different developmental stages. So I think this quote is really important. So Judith Birch, she is one of the leading researchers in what's called multisensory instruction of the language. But really this quote is just to remind us that reading and writing are not naturally occurring human phenomena. These are things that we as a society or societies have created over the last couple of centuries. And there is no reading part of our brain. We actually use a number of different pieces of our brain to create a pathway to become a fluent reader. And I always stick this in there because teaching reading or learning to read, it really is a science. There's a lot of research out there that has shown again and again what those key pieces of reading instruction look like. And also what those different stages look like and what needs to happen at each stage. So before we get into the different stages of reading, to just kind of talk a little bit about what that process might look like for each child, because every kid is totally different. And so it's really important to keep in mind this idea of a bell curve, right? So we can use this to explain any phenomenon in any population, including that learning to read process. So this is a really important thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about your own kids going through that those reading developmental stages. So all the way over here on the right side of the curve, we're gonna have those couple of kids who just kind of somehow teach themselves to read. They pick up a book and they're reading. They didn't really have to go to school necessarily. They didn't necessarily have to learn their letters. They might need a little bit of instruction along the way, but they just kind of figured it out themselves for the most part. But all these kids here in this, especially in this middle dark blue, and then over here to this bit, they're going to need to go to school. They're going to learn their phonological awareness. They're going to practice those metacognitive skills. They're going to learn their letter sounds. They're going to take some time, and they're going to learn how to read, but they need to be taught how to do it. That's where most of our kids are. When we get over to the left of this bell curve, those kids are going to need a lot more explicit instruction, a lot more systematic instruction, and they're going to need a lot more time to practice it. So even if we get all the way over to that left-hand side, those kids are still going to learn to read, but they might need one-on-one instruction, an hour a day, 5 days a week for 3 years, but they will still learn how to read. But with all of these stages, this is a really, really important thing to keep in mind. We want to make sure that we are always keeping kids in what's called that zone of proximal development, where we're pushing them enough to keep them challenged, but we're not pushing them so much that we're frustrating them. And that we're always making sure that if we need to slow down, if we need to back up and go over something again, that we have that flexibility in mind. And that is a really huge philosophy in our IRW program. We want to make sure that we're meeting kids where they are and helping them move along in a way that makes sense for their developmental progress. So just to kind of quickly go over that science of reading instruction, there are a lot of different models out there, but again, we have decades and decades of research that shows exactly what needs to happen at what stage when we're learning to read. And so this science is a huge part of what has informed the creation of our inspirED Reader and Writer program. But with any model, however you get there, the ultimate goal of reading is to understand. If you're not comprehending, you're not reading. And that's another big thing to keep in mind. This is a model that was created by a researcher named Scarborough called the Scarborough Reading Rope. I think it's a really great visual way to think about all these different elements that come together when we're talking about learning how to read. So what happens is we're explicitly teaching all of these skills, all those little strands you see. And as we practice and as we get better at them, as we become more fluent, it slowly builds together more and more and more until at the end of that rope, you are what we call a fluent reader, which is what we as adults mostly are. So if you're picking up a book, you don't really have to think about the words on the page anymore. You read it. And as you're reading it, you always have that sort of running monologue in your mind of, did I understand? What do I think is going to happen next? Does that fit with what I already know about the world? And if any of those pieces ever fall apart, as a fluent reader, you have the skills to stop and say, oh, wait, I didn't quite understand that part. Maybe I should go back and read it again. Or maybe I need to stop and look up what this word means. So that's, of course, where we want our kids to get to. But there's a lot of stuff that has to happen before they become those skilled readers. But reading and writing go hand in hand. So we can't talk about reading unless we're talking about writing. So to talk a little bit about what a skilled writer looks like, we'll jump into that. So just like with reading, the ultimate goal of reading is comprehension. The ultimate goal of writing is that written expressive language. We want to be able to get our thoughts and ideas down on a page in a way that somebody else can pick it up and read it and make sense of it. That's really our ultimate goal of writing. Of course, there are many nuances to that, but that's really what the point of writing is. So this is another really great model from Nijhuis Education Center, which is a research center in the US. They have this balancing act. And they actually have this exact same one for reading. And that right-hand side, the composition creativity, is exactly the same with reading. Those are things that we really need to make sure are very, very strong in order for us to not only be a skilled reader, but a skilled writer. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute, but jumping over to the left-hand side, those are those mechanics. And this is the stuff that oftentimes seems a little bit easier to teach, handwriting, punctuation, grammar, spelling, But again, a lot of times these are pieces that need to be explicitly taught. Kids will see a question mark in a book again and again and again, but unless you kind of stop and say, hey, why is that little squiggly mark in there? What's it called? What's the point of it? Most kids are going to make the connection between them asking a question and how their voice goes up, and then reading that question, and then of course writing that question when they're getting it down on the page. But to come back to that composition and creativity side, that's a really important piece, and that's one of the huge areas that our IRW really focuses on, having that really strong oral language base, having that as extensive oral knowledge as we can, but particularly that strategic thinking and that inference making, because you got to be able to think in order to be a good reader and writer. So just to kind of jump into the actual Inspired Reader and Writer program, to give you a little background on how we came about to this program. So this is something that we've been doing for quite a while. I joined Baker & Bloom a little over 2 years ago, and that's where we went through the sort of revision process. So I myself have been one of the chief architects of the program, but of course with lots of input from all of our teachers, parents, students, other professionals. But the really great thing about the program, at least in my opinion, is that that science of reading and writing is deeply embedded into it. So we make sure that we're ticking the boxes all along the way. So when we were thinking about designing this program, we started with these big questions. One of the first big questions I had was, well, if you're a fifth grader, what are actually those key core skills that you really need to have? What does it look like to be a skilled fifth grade thinker, reader, and writer? And then the next level of that question was, okay, well, this is what we want our K-3 students to look like. What are schools in Hong Kong already doing really well? What piece can we take out of that puzzle? Because we only have an hour and a half a week. We want to be really explicit on those missing links. So that was kind of the next layer of that. Finding those key skills. And then the next layer of that was even boiling that down even more to just those key skills, and then figuring out how to do it in a fun, creative way. So that when they come, they want to be here, they're enjoying what they're doing, and they're having fun with reading and writing, because that's a huge, huge part of learning as well. But really it came down to giving kids a toolbox. So the strategies and the skills and the knowledge that we teach are not specific to any particular program or any particular curriculum. They're skills that can be applied to whatever they're doing. So we have students that come from pretty much every school around Hong Kong, and the skills that we are teaching them, they can take back to their own classrooms and they can apply. So they're going to be asked to write a persuasive essay. Hey, I practiced that in Baker & Bloom. I know how to have that hook to start it off. Or they're going to be asked to analyze poetry. I know what figurative language is. These are skills that I've already learned. And this is really looking at that missing link. So like I talked about, finding those pieces that we know schools are doing well, removing that, and then really looking back at that reading rope and thinking, what are actually the missing links? And there's a couple of pieces when it comes to reading and writing instruction that are absolutely, absolutely essential. But that I have found, and this isn't just Hong Kong, it's worldwide, a lot of schools just don't do, or they just don't do well. So making sure that those pieces, those foundational missing links are actually in our program. So to talk a little bit more about the program, it is a K1 through grade 6. So it is what we call a spiraling curriculum. So those kids all the way through, they're never going to do the same thing twice, but they're going to come back to those same skill sets, but they're going to deepen their understanding and they're going to deepen their knowledge of it. One thing that's really important with this, jumping ahead of myself, with these year bands, so these grades, just as a side note, we use the American demarcation for grades, but it doesn't, you know, it's really just a label, to be honest, because really what we're looking at is this. So whenever we have a new student come and join us, or even at the beginning of a module or partway through the year, we're going to check in with that kid and we're going to see what are they actually able to do. So oftentimes that's going to look like a diagnostic. It might look like them performing, you know, doing some performative piece. Maybe we're going to ask them to read something or write something. And then that gives us a glimpse of, well, what are they actually already really good at and what do they still need support in? And then for those kids who were kind of on the mix, well, maybe maybe at school they're a first grader, but we're actually going to recommend that they drop back down to K3 because there's a couple of those foundational things we want to work on. Or on the, on the edge, maybe they're actually a fourth grader, but they're quite old for their age. And so we're going to want to recommend for them to go up. So it really is the stage, not the age. But speaking of stages, so this chart comes from a researcher, Jeannie S. Shaw. She was one of the initial researchers who kind of laid out what these different stages of reading development look like. She did a lot of her research back in the 70s and 80s, but no one's really been able to refute what she came up with. So these are the 6 stages that I'm going to use to kind of show you guys what each age, what each stage looks like, what ages that might be attached to, and then a couple of the ways that we support these different key skills and strategies at the different stages. Now, as I go through the different stages, this is not a detailed explanation of what each stage looks like or what each year band looks like. Great, so year band grade 1, 2, for example. But it's just going to be kind of a glimpse of some of the things we do as we go through. And a lot of these things will repeat because, as I said, it is a spiraling curriculum. So inferencing, for example, if we expect a 6th grader to be able to read a Shakespeare sonnet and make inferences about the word choices that he made, we're going to back that all the way up to K1, K2, and we're going to start to make kind of baby inferences about the pictures and the stories we're reading. So that's an example of that spiraling. So to start off with the little guys in English, that K1 to 3. So typically this is going to be a 3 to 5. Sometimes we will see some 6-year-olds in there. It really just depends on the kid. And again, that goes back to that diagnostic. But here's kind of what you might see in that 0 stage, so that pre-reading stage. Give you guys a second to read through that. One thing to keep in mind too with a lot of these stages, and again, this is happening a lot in Hong Kong, but it's happening the world over. This is not just a local phenomenon, but what kids are being asked to do and expected to do is way sooner than what is developmentally appropriate. So if you look at this, pre-reading is really through 6 years old. So developmentally speaking, and some kids are ready for it, but a lot of kids are not. They're not really quite ready to read and understand until they get into 1st grade. So that's a really important thing to remember, especially when you're talking, kind of thinking about your own kids' development. But some of the things we want to make sure we're doing, so here's a couple of the books you might be reading, and a lot of it is reading with the kids, a lot of it reading to them. Dr. Seuss I absolutely love because there's a lot of rhyming in there. You want to build up that phonological awareness skills, which are really, really important. But one of the big things we look at with those little guys is building that oral language base. A lot of this comes through read alouds. So here's an example. Even with all this online education, we're still able to hold on to one of these core tenets of those little Kai programs. So this was a module that the K1-3 teacher taught at the end of this past school year. And this is just a range of the books. So you could probably guess the topic was superheroes. But reading through these different books, they were learning all the vocabulary around it. But most importantly, they were learning about character development, how they can describe their superhero, what it might look like, all these different pieces of that oral language. This is a photo of them, then being able to reproduce that oral language skills. So obviously they've been reading Little Red Riding Hood. And so they've been reading it, they've been talking about it, and finally they get to practice being in the story. Another way that we really bring in that oral language piece, again, through the stories, is using these flow charts. So this was an example. They had listened to a story. They didn't drew little pictures to remind themselves what happened in the story. We talked about how you use arrows to show the movement across it. And then they had to work with their partner to present the story, retell what had happened. Another big piece in that K1 through 3, and really all ages, is that world knowledge. This is really, really important. But again, even with those little guys, you can start it. So this was another module, toys, that was taught completely online at the beginning of this past spring semester, this past school year. And what they did is they read different storybooks from all around the world. So you can see those little arrows, just a few of the places that the books came from. And as they were reading these different storybooks, they were learning about the cultures, about the place, they were finding them on the maps, and kind of building that world language, that world knowledge base, which is really important when it comes to that comprehension side of reading. Of course, those foundational skills are key. And this is a part of the program that you will see in every year band, regardless of the age. But one of those big ones in the K1 through 3 is that phonological awareness. So this is really, really important. And this is one of the huge missing links that I've seen again and again and again with students that come in and the programs that they're getting at school. This is not necessarily being taught, but it is absolutely essential to become a fluent comprehending reader. So this is definitely something you'll see really in all the year bands, but particularly in that K1, 3 and grade 1, 2. And so moving on to the, grade 1, 2, getting ahead of myself here. So this is kind of that 6 to 7, 6 to 8-year-old range. And this is where you kind of see some kids move up or down, especially if they're coming from more of a UK system. Maybe they're in year 2, which would be grade 1. Kind of just figuring out what actually is the right space for these kids. But if we kind of step back and we look at what the research and the development, really the brain development actually shows us, first grade is really when kids are they're actually starting to read. And it really wasn't until even about 10 years ago that we expected kindergartners and K2, K1 kids to be reading. A lot of them are not ready for that. Some of them are, which is wonderful. But moving into grade 1, grade 2, this is where we're really what we call breaking the code, right? So English is it's an alphabetic code, right? We've got these random images on a page that somehow connect to sounds and then all string together to make a word. That's what writing is. And you've got to break the code. And it could take a couple years of instruction to do that. And typically it does. So these are a lot of the kinds of books that they'll be reading when they're doing that breaking the code piece. I really, really strongly recommend decodable books at this age, when the kids are reading the books. If you are reading to them, everything's open. But when they're first learning to break that code, decodables are really important, because what you want to essentially train the kids to do is they need to really read every letter on the page. Reading is not guessing. And what happens is when you give kids books to read with sounds and letters and such that they don't know yet, they're going to try to guess. But reading is not guessing. They read the letters on the page. And as they learn more letter-sound correspondences, more spelling patterns, obviously those decodables become bigger and bigger. But you can have decodable readers all the way through 3rd and 4th grade. So if you're thinking about kids who are kind of struggling a little bit with that breaking the code, you really want to make sure that they're hanging out for quite a while with these decodable readers. But even when they're learning to break the code, we can be focusing a lot on these reading comprehension skills, because you're sort of building all of this at the same time. So they're learning to break the code or learning to decode while you're also building that vocabulary and the world language and the thinking skills that will then all come together and help them become those fluent readers. So reading comprehension skills at this age can still come a lot through read alouds. So this is an example. This was actually a module that was taught 2 years ago, which will be starting again here this next week for our grade 1, 2 about Cinderella. And the reason that I chose the Cinderella stories is because there are so many different versions that the kids are able to, just like with that toys module, they're really learning the world knowledge behind it. But the other great thing about this Cinderella is that because the plot repeats every time, that gives them, they already understand that piece of the story, and that then gives them the confidence to actually step into that reading, analyzing role. And they're actually able to deeply compare and contrast the different versions of Cinderella, and helping them get past just that surface level of, oh, well, this Cinderella is blonde and that Cinderella is brunette, but actually, what are their character traits? How does that then impact what they're doing? So using these stories that are beautiful and lovely and that they're really comfortable with to then move into that reading comprehension piece. Here's another example. This was from a nonfiction unit. They were reading all different kinds of nonfiction and starting to teach them how to find main ideas, supporting ideas, and key details. So again, these are really key comprehension strategies that we can start really early on. Obviously, creativity is a huge part, and this isn't something that I'm directly showing you guys during this talk, but this is woven into everything we do. Every time we're going to teach anything, we're going to think, how can we make this fun? How can we make it engaging? How can we get the kids excited about what we're doing? But here's an example. So this was from that same, they had read the nonfiction about bridges, and here they got to build a bridge. So they got a bunch of materials. They had to work with their partner to build a bridge, and they had to find the most stable structure to support their little cars, which were just some plastic things that they got to stick in there. But just so they got to have some fun. And this is really building that creativity and that critical thinking as well. They had to really think through what they were doing. Again, that writing process. So all of our classes are capped at 6 students, but they're rarely even that big. Most of the time, they're going to be 2, 3, 4 kids. So as they go through these different reading and writing processes, they get so much guidance and so much support. So I wanted to share with you guys an example of what that writing process might look like. This was a 6.5-year-old. You can see I was a class that I was teaching. So this was one of our first brainstorms in that pre-write phase. They were writing a small moment story. He wanted to write about the time he went on a trip to, I think it was Thailand or Bali, I can't remember. We'll find out here in a bit. And he wanted to talk about that item. So the thing that he first came up with was the ticket. So we were talking about what that ticket looked like, what it might feel like, what colors it might be, or what shape it might be, kind of brainstorming all of those descriptive pieces. And then we were thinking, we're taking that special object and we were turning that into a small moment story. So really thinking about a story is not just a string of things that have happened. We have a clear beginning, middle, and end. So let's think about that moment of you going on this trip. What did that actually look like? And then let's slow it down even more. Let's really peel apart that one moment. And now that we have our one moment, let's think about all the different ways we could describe that moment. So this piece in particular, we're talking a lot about those sensory descriptive pieces. So using those 5 senses, so helping him brainstorm all of that. And a lot of this comes out through teachers sharing ideas, through stories that you've read together, a lot of guidance to help kids get there. He had his, this was his rough draft, and then we sat down together and we conferenced about it, helped him kind of piece apart some of the different ways to make it better. One of the things that he was really working on was making sure that he had full stops or periods regularly throughout his piece. So after he'd read it, you can probably see a lot of the capitals that have gone back in there. He kind of had one giant sentence. So one of the things that I did was, hey, you've got a beautiful story, you've got tons of ideas in there, and this is fantastic. But one of the things I noticed is that I only see one full stop or one period. I always ask whatever the kids call it, that's what we call it, throughout the whole thing. So remember, when we're reading, we use a period to let us know where the reader's going to stop. So I want you to follow along as I read you your piece, and I want you to think, where in here could you add some periods? And that was one of the revisions that he did. And then obviously with that editing, the spelling and stuff, some of that we just kind of step in and help him with. And here was his final piece. So Barcelona, that's where he went. So you can see through all of these different sort of mini lessons and guided lessons and guided revisions, he ended up with this beautiful piece. And this was something that, a barely 6, I think he was 6.5, first grader was able to produce because he was really supported throughout that writing process. And then, of course, he got to publish. So here was the plane of him moving along. So bringing in that sort of fun, creative piece as well. One of the things we really want to start looking at, even in those early years, is text type specific strategies. And the reason we start building this into the 1st and 2nd grade is because this is one of the huge deficits that we see a lot of times when kids come in 3rd and 4th grade, as they don't actually know, they don't deeply know the difference between these different text types. So the difference between persuasive and opinion. What does that mean? What does the structure of the piece look like? So we always want to balance out. We did lots of narrative pieces. The next module, we switched gears into that nonfiction piece. So again, this is the module, I put these in here because this is the module that we'll be teaching the 2nd half of this fall for grade 1, 2. So that sort of narrative piece, and then switching gears into the informative. Moving on into upper primary, grade 3, 4. you know, and this is a lot of times where we see what we call the fourth grade slump. This is where things kind of start to fall apart sometimes. But before we get to that, so the big thing here is they're really moving into that fluent reader piece. So sometimes you'll see it in second grade, so you'll kind of see a little bit of an overlap here, but they're not so much working on just reading the words on the page. Now they're able to switch gears a little bit more and think about they're actually reading, right? They're understanding what they're reading. They're building that fluency piece. So they're not sort of chunking up each word as they go. They read it in a fluent manner. So they're starting to move a lot more into chapter books. If you've heard me talk before, I know I always go on and on about chapter book series. I think they're great. They really gives the kids an opportunity to be comfortable with the characters in the story, and the plot is the only part that's really changing. But as I was saying in grade 3-4, those foundational skills are really, really important. And that's because there's a huge shift. What's happening in the early half of primary is kids are learning to read, right? They're learning their letter sounds, they're learning their phonics, phonological awareness, all of those pieces are there. By the time they get to usually 4th grade, there's this huge shift where they're no longer learning to read, they're now reading to learn. So they're expected to read and understand and then do something with it. And not just when they're in English class, but when they're in any content area, those skills are being pulled. But what happens a lot of the times is that those foundational skills aren't strong enough. They don't have that really strong foundation. But then all of a sudden they're supposed to build a skyscraper on top of that foundation, and well, that skyscraper falls apart. And again, this comes from Genius Chall, the researcher that I mentioned at the very beginning, that 4th grade slump. Now, it's not always 4th grade, but that's typically where we see a huge shift in expectations as far as what schools are expecting. So the way we, as the designers of the IRW, responded to that is by really focusing on those foundational skills. Because what we don't want to happen is this. And this basically means that, and this goes back to that language acquisition, where when you're learning to read, the biggest way you learn new vocabulary is through talking to people, through conversations. Once you become a fluent reader, or you're supposed to have already become a fluent reader, you shift to learning all of your new words through reading. And that expectation of your vocabulary just increases as you get older through primary and on into secondary and even on into university. So if you don't have that strong base, you're not going to want to read. And if you don't want to read, it's just this downward spiral. So this is what we want to make sure doesn't happen, which is why those foundational skills, we sprinkle them all the way through the K1 through grade 2, but we put a little bit more of an emphasis on them in grade 3 and grade 4, but always in a fun way and always in a way that makes sense. So this is one of the ways that we can kind of bring in some of those foundational skills into the inspirED Reader and Writer program. So everyone out there, teachers, parents, everyone just loves to say, oh, well, spelling in English, it just doesn't make sense. You just got to learn it. Well, that's not exactly true. There are some words that are unusual, right, and look weird. But if you actually know why they're spelled that way, they're going to be reliable 87% of the time. So basically what that means is that if I'm going to spell a word, I might drop a vowel or have the wrong vowel in this place or the other. But if I actually know all these different pieces of the language, I'm going to spell that word correctly pretty much every time. And when I come across to read it, I'm going to read that word accurately pretty much every time for these 87% of words. And so one of the things we really start looking at in that grade 3-4, first of all, is grammar. Now, I know grammar, sometimes we all kind of pull a face when we hear that word, but it does have a really important piece in being a skilled reader and writer, because in order to be a skilled reader and writer, you need to understand the structure of the language. So we don't teach grammar just for grammar's sake. It's not something that we throw in there just because, we like it, but it's embedded into what we're doing. So for example, this was from a grade 3-4 class it was a descriptive writing module about poetry and description. And one of the things that the teacher noticed was that a lot of these kids were really struggling with having that subject-verb agreement. So, which is again, really, really common in that age. So we actually stepped back and we talked a little bit about the grammar behind that, and then helping them see when it makes sense, and then recognizing how to change it themselves. Another big thing, once you know this grammar behind the language, you know where you can stretch out those sentences, right? So this was an example. They got a very basic sentence, the dog walked along, and then they had to think, where can I cut it apart? Where can I insert those adjectives and adverbs and adverbial clauses and all that stuff to kind of bring my sentence to life? And these kids got really excited. They didn't want to just write one, they wrote a whole list of them for each one. And I know some of these pictures, you know, obviously are from pre-online instruction, but we've been working really, really hard over the last, 6 months to move all of this, the same activity, the same pedagogy, all online as well. So this is another one of the big things that'll start to pop up more and more starting in grade 3 and on up, is using that morphological knowledge. So really that comes down to Latin roots, to Greek roots, to suffixes, prefixes, and using those chunks of the word to know what they mean. And so to be able to know what they mean when you read them, and then also to know how to spell them properly. Because if you think of the word construction, if you just sound it out, that shun at the end, you're probably going to want to spell S-H-U-N. But if you know that shun is in fact a suffix that's been added on, you're going to know that that shun is always going to be spelled T-I-O-N. So even by just teaching these little key things, they know what the words mean and they're able to spell them as well. So this is an example of a pretty extreme structured word inquiry box that we might build. This is obviously this is kind of towards the end of primary where we really taught a lot of these things, but kind of just teach them how to play with the chunks of words and what they mean. But also really looking at that oral language base, which is so important. So when they're moving into grade 3 and then on into upper primary and beyond, they're going to be expected to have a more and more sophisticated vocabulary. And there are different ways to build that. One of the biggest ones is, again, through the read aloud. So even in grade 3, they're still going to be listening to that teacher read and using these sort of mentor texts as examples. And when we're teaching the vocabulary, it's always going to be in context. So we're not just kind of randomly teaching different words. We're learning these words as we read them. We're also talking about shades of meaning. So smells, for example, what's the difference between putrid and stinky? How can we sort of tease apart all of these different words, and how are they all connected? That self-reflection piece, again, this is something we do in all of the year bands, but moving into the grade 3, we're really pushing for them to be more and more self-reflective. So this was an example from one of our online classes. This was a clip from a Pixar short film that they watched. I think it's only like 2.5 minutes, but they used this to kind of talk about resilience, to talk about how they might bounce back. So they're learning they're building those thinking skills and those self-reflecting skills, but we're also helping support that social emotional piece. So we try to bring absolutely everything into that 90 minutes or 60 minutes that we have with them. Moving on into the last year band from primary, that grade 5-6. So again, traditionally, this is going to be kind of the 9 to 11-year-old range. But again, it really depends on the kid. And as we move up into primary, obviously the expectations, as I've been saying, increase greatly. So maybe actually we have, some kids in grade 5-6, maturity-wise, they're absolutely there. But on the foundational skills side, maybe they're not there yet. So if we feel that that's something that the IRW, that Inspired Reader Writer, can support, that's always an option. Sometimes though, we will complement that with some academic coaching, which is that one-on-one tutoring, which is 100% driven by exactly what that kid needs. But with all of our Inspired Reader and Writer classes, there's always a foundational skills piece in every single lesson. And that is always driven by what that group of students need. But kind of moving up into the upper primary, this is where we really see that shift for learning to read to now they're reading to learn. And so one of the big things that we see in moving up into upper primary and beyond are textbooks. And textbooks are really, really hard, right? There's a lot that they need to know to be able to understand a textbook. So we want to make sure that we're explicitly teaching the skills that they'll need in order to read the kinds of books that they'll be expected to read. So one of those foundational skills you'll see pop up again in all of them, but we really come back to a lot in grade 3, 4, and grade 5, 6, is using those text features. So even, you know, the textbook over here in the corner, most kids are just going to start in the upper left-hand corner. They're just going to kind of read their way through. But obviously as adult skilled readers, we know that's not the best way to go about it. So teaching them how to work their way through textbooks, news articles, all of these things, so that they have those reading comprehension skills to help them attack any piece they might be asked to read. One of the other big things that, again, this is happening in every year band, but we really focus on a lot in the grade 5, 6, and up, is what we call these author's craft techniques. So by the time we get to grade 5, 6, we have hoped that they've learned all of the skills to write a quality, or to write a well-structured story, or a well-structured informative piece, or persuasive, or whatever it is that their text type they're being asked to write, because they would have built that oral language base, they would have learned a lot of the foundational skills. In that grade 3, 4, they would have been explicitly taught the different structures of the different text types, and now they're ready to kind of put all the fancy touches on them. And that's what these author's craft techniques are. So one of those is really honing in on that idea and making it really clear to the kids that writing is a process, and we go through it again and again and again, right? So we've got that muddy pit, we find our gem, and we keep buffing it and shining it and making it better until finally we have that beautiful gem at the end. So one way of doing that is, again, through what we call mentor text. So this was an excerpt from a short story that they read, all about interior monologue. So we were talking about how using that interior monologue kind of helps bring your characters to life. So we talked about what it was, we read it in this example, and then they went to their story and they embedded it into what they were doing. And while they're writing, the teachers are kind of popping in it and conferencing with each kid to make sure that they have any questions, they need any help, or is there something that they actually, some other tips that they could be getting. And the great thing with the grade 3, 4, grade 5, 6, with this move to online, is that obviously everything's on Google Docs. So the teacher can really see what everyone's actually writing, and then he or she can directly comment on there, can make revisions. All of these things can happen digitally. But using lots of story starters. So, and these can just be quick little games. Sometimes it'll pop up, and then, they kind of just have to come up with some sort of story to go with it. Just kind of building that creativity and that quick thinking piece. But yeah, creativity obviously is hugely important. So this was an example of a descriptive piece that one of our students did. And so this was actually a photo from a photojournalism series from the New York Times. They were able to go through, choose the photo that resonated with them. And then they spent a number of weeks writing a descriptive writing piece. So this example, you can see, we really looked a lot at that author's craft technique. We talked about word choice, and we talked about figurative language. So he added in those onomatopoeias with the ah, woo, crash. We talked about sentence fluency. So that really resonated with him. So he came back and he added in all those sort of short, punchy sentences, so that every sentence kind of has a different length to it and different rhythm. And then he got super creative, and he kind of wanted to add in different fonts and all this sort of things. So that was an example of one of his descriptive pieces. But of course, we want to still make sure that we're focusing on those foundational skills. So this is really, really important. And actually, we were just having a conversation about this as a team earlier today. So Latin roots are so important. So not only for that knowing how to spell it, but really for that reading and that understanding and knowing what that word means. And this becomes more and more important as they move up, and they're expected to read more and more challenging texts. So our grade 5, 6 is going to have a lot of work around Latin roots and Greek roots, and where we can find them, how we can use them. So you as parents, this is a really great article. If you want to find out kind of a list of more root words and affixes and prefixes and such that are out there, I recommend, this is a really great website too, if you ever have any other kind of questions about stuff. That's in there. But so just to kind of wrap up before we get to any questions, this is sort of an overview of all of the offerings we have. Obviously that inspired reader and writer is what we've been mostly talking about during this last 45 minutes, but we have a lot of other things that we do as well. And that one-on-one coaching and those private courses, those are actually becoming more and more popular as well, particularly with this move to the online. But we have a couple of other talks coming up as well. If you're interested more in this creativity and particularly that creative writing piece, I definitely recommend you come tomorrow, Wednesday at 1 o'clock to listen to Miss Lenore Look. She's one of our primary creative writing teachers. She's a published author herself. She's fantastic. Of course, there's that inspirED STEM tomorrow evening to talk about kind of how STEM can help you think about the future and make sure you're prepared for that. Thursday is a little bit more on the secondary side. And then Friday, very, very exciting, Friday evening or afternoon, I guess, 4 to 6. Myself and the other founding teams, as well as Ms. Renee Bowie, our founder, we will be presenting our brand new school that is starting. It's a bilingual school all about innovation and positive education. So if you're interested in finding out one of the forefronts of Hong Kong education, tune in then. And then Saturday is really all about admissions and boarding school. But thank you guys so much. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them in the chat box now. Unmute if you want to, say anything. But yeah, thank you guys so much. And if you can't think of any questions now, if you want to email us, reach out, please do. If you'd like to sign up for anything, please go on our website, send us an email, let us know what you're interested in, and we can help recommend courses as well. But yeah, thank you guys so much for checking in. All right, looks like we have a question, so I'm going to stop share. Yeah, so if you have any questions, definitely email us as well. And we really hope to see you and your kiddos either online or back in person soon. Yeah, so yeah, so we've got some questions coming in. So for writing, so the IRW is going to be that inspired reader and writer is going to be a good first call. So the inspired reader writer, it really is a balance between reading and writing because they do go hand in hand. So if you're looking for just kind of overall writing support, that's going to be a good one. We also have creative writing classes starting in grade 3 and up. So if you're looking for more of that creative writing side, where you're really diving more deeply into the structure of the different pieces, those different author's craft techniques, that's going to be a really good one as well. So it kind of just depends on which text type you're looking for, and the depth of support that you're looking for. But yeah, one of these other questions about diagnostic assessments. So that's something we have kind of 2 different versions of those. So one we do, anytime we have a new student, we do a diagnostic. It's typically about 30 or 45 minutes. And that's going to be kind of a snapshot of all of whatever the kid in that grade level needs. So for example, if we have a new kid join us who's in 4th grade at this school, we're going to pull together the pieces that we think they kind of should probably know by that point. And then that will really help us think about which class that kid should be in and how best we can support them. Those diagnostics are free if then they sign up for a class. The other options would be a really more deep dive diagnostic. So if you're really concerned and just thinking, well, there's something that's just not quite right, there's more extensive diagnostics that we can do, more extensive screeners. Yeah, so as far as the K3, it really is a mix. So our program is designed to be a mix of all of the things they need at that point. So it really is kind of a one-stop shop. The one thing that we don't do quite so much of in the K3 out of the list you have there is the phonics. So we're going to focus a lot on phonological awareness because that's one of those really, really key pieces. So we're going to make sure that that's really, really strong. We're going to focus a lot on the language piece, so that understanding of it and then producing it. And really working on that storytelling piece, and the handwriting is going to come out with, of course, writing. So letter formation, if that's what they need. If they're not writing yet, the teacher can help them encode. They'll be doing a lot of recording as well. Because really with the K3, we want to make sure that they're comfortable with sharing their ideas, with being those storytellers, and creating those really detailed illustrations. Because if you want them to then grow into detailed writers who are writing those detailed stories, they first need to get the language out. They need to be speaking it. So if that's really complex and that's really beautiful and deep, that's when to transition to their writing when they're working on all of those other foundational pieces at the same time. So the K3, it's really focused on those kind of key phonological awareness pieces, a little bit of the letter formation, a little bit of phonics, depending on what those kids need. Most of the lesson is going to be around reading comprehension strategies. So through those read alouds, building that oral language base, and really getting them to be expressive and creative. I don't know if that answered your question. Great. But for Patricia, I don't know if you had some more specific questions about the writing, or if you wanted to let us know. You know, you certainly follow up with an email or something as well if you're kind of looking for a little bit more specific feedback. It really just depends on what you're looking for and what age your kids are. Any other questions? Yeah, thank you for that. So we don't usually share the full recording of the Zoom, but we will always share key pieces of it on our website. So once the tech magicians have pulled out the best bits and sort of fine-tuned it down, you'll see some of that coming up on our YouTube channel and on our website as well. Any other questions? But yeah, please, if you have any other questions, I'll show you our, so here's our information one more time. Feel free to call, send an email. You know, and if you have a specific question for me, just stick it in there as well, and it'll get forwarded on to me and we can chat a little bit more. But yeah, I would definitely say if you have any questions or concerns about where your kids are with any of these different pieces, please reach out. I know especially now that, you know, schools are kind of moving more and more online, there definitely is that concern that some of those foundational pieces, or even some of those kind of those creative, innovative pieces are kind of getting lost. So if you have any concerns about that, please do give us a call or email. Yeah, so the courses, so for the first couple of weeks, they will be all online. Good question. So we are hoping to obviously have everyone back in person as soon as possible, but obviously with the restrictions in place and everything. So we hope that in the next couple of weeks, we'll be able to move it back in person, or at least pieces of it back in person. But as I mentioned earlier, we as a team have been working really, really hard for the last 8 months, really, to make sure that the same quality of instruction that we have in person is transitioning to that online as well. So working with different experts to make sure we have the best tools and the best pedagogy to make sure that we are still delivering those key deliverables, whether it's through a screen or in person. Actually, we had a really great presentation yesterday evening where one of our admin guys, he shared some videos of what some of that instruction looks like. And actually one of them was with a 4-year-old who was still doing really engaging, interactive math. It was a STEM class all through the screen. So there are ways to do it, even when it's online. So yeah, any other questions? Great. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I will let you guys all enjoy this lovely rainy Tuesday evening. And please tune in again later on this week for the rest of our talks, and we will see you then. Good night, everyone.